Another important structure that forms as the fetus is developing is something called the amniotic sac. Another structure that forms is called the amniotic sac, and this forms around the embryo. And we can see it here a little bit. Um, this this is the amniotic sac, and basically it's a fluid-filled membrane that sort of cushions the embryo. The embryo and the fetus is floating around in this fluid throughout all of development, and eventually it will rupture when the fetus is about to be born, but helps protect the embryo. So if we think about the process of birth and development, we use a couple different terms that you probably have heard before. So the time from fertilization to when the fetus is born is called the prenatal period. And so the amount of time that a given species develops in the womb is called its gestation. And in humans, gestation takes about 40 weeks. Okay. About 9 months or so, actually a little bit more. Between 38 and 42 weeks is sort of typical and normal. But that's about the length of human gestation, about 40 weeks. Different animals have different gestational periods. Some other terms. The zygote is the term for the single cell fertilized egg. Okay. Right after fertilization, the cell that's produced is called the zygote. When it begins dividing by mitosis, then it's called the embryo. It's called an embryo for 8 weeks. After 8 weeks, it is start to use the term fetus. And it's a fetus while it's in the womb, developing in the uterus until birth. It's called postnatal period is after that fetus is born. While this embryo is developing, material that the mother is consuming can make its way to the developing embryo and fetus through the placenta. This is why things like alcohol and drugs, smoking, can have negative effects on fetal development, especially in the early stages. In the early stages of development, the major organ systems are forming. The brain is starting to form in the heart. And at these times, the embryo is extremely vulnerable to the negative effects of things like alcohol or nicotine and smoking and drugs. And so typically when a woman is pregnant, she will be advised by a doctor to stop smoking, not to drink at all, not to use any drugs, because of the potential impacts to the embryo as it develops. Sometimes a doctor will want to do a scan of the developing fetus using an ultrasound or using an amniocentesis, which is extracting some of the fluid from the amniotic sac to study it. You can tell if the chromosome number is typical. You can determine the sex chromosomes that the fetus might have. Could diagnose certain conditions if using that amniotic fluid. A sonogram is making basically a picture of the developing fetus. You can see a sonogram picture or ultrasound picture here. They're the same thing, where they use sound waves to look at the developing fetus. Sometimes they can tell it's the sex of the baby. Sometimes they can tell how old and the gestational age of that fetus, so they know about when the pregnancy, when the baby will be due. These things can be diagnosed using a sonogram. And we can see a sonogram picture here. And sometimes pregnancies do end in a miscarriage. A miscarriage is the term for the death of the embryo or fetus before it is able to survive on its own. And actually, miscarriages are fairly common. About 10 to 20% of pregnancies end in a miscarriage, where for some reason that embryo or fetus was not able to survive. We can see here, you'll be doing activities studying the different stages of development. But we see these are the embryonic stages of development from, here a single cell growing into the later stages through mitosis and differentiation And you can see as time's going on, then this embryo starts to look more and more human-like. Okay, until it reaches, these are the fetal stages here. But this is just 5 millimeters. This is very, very, very small. But you can see what sort of things will look like as this embryo develops into a fetus. Once the gestational time has passed, over the 40 weeks of gestation, as you can see, the major organ systems are forming, the circulatory system, the heart, the brain, the nervous system, and so forth. After reaching sort of the fetal stages, then the growth of the embryo is the maturing of those organs, as well as a very rapid growth in the size of that fetus. And one of the last organs to mature in a fetus are the lungs. And so that's why sometimes if a baby is born prematurely, before it is fully developed, it may need help with a ventilator, because the lungs are the last organ to mature in a fetus. And that makes sense, because the fetus never uses the lungs. They never are needed until it's actually born. And that's because the fetus is getting its oxygen through the placenta. It's not breathing on its own. Once the gestational time is gone by, and it's about time when a woman is going to go into labor, we have a couple stages. So labor is the term for the process that happens when the uterus starts to contract. The uterus is a muscle, and it begins contracting and squeezing like any other muscle of the body. And what that does is it starts to move the fetus down lower into the uterus. It also starts to open up the cervix. The cervix, if you remember, is the opening of the uterus. And so while a woman is in labor, she will feel contractions. She will feel her uterus tighten and contract. And as labor is going on, those contractions become more intense, maybe more painful. They start to become closer together. They happen more quickly. In the process of having these contractions, what it's doing is it's dilating the cervix to about 10 centimeters, causing the cervix to what's called efface, or sort of thin. And it's getting ready to allow the fetus to come through the cervix and then eventually be born through the vagina. Sometimes a woman can be given certain medications that cause her uterus to contract more intensely, called Pitocin. She makes these similar hormones in her own body, which stimulates childbirth. But if the doctor wants her to have the child more quickly, or if there's a problem, she may be given a medication called Pitocin, which will cause these uterine contractions to increase. Eventually, after the labor phase is over, then comes the delivery phase. And in the delivery phase is when a woman will be pushing the fetus out through the cervix, into the vagina, and out of the vagina, okay, in a vaginal birth. And so that process typically, the contractions, the uterine contractions during labor are involuntary. They are just happening to a woman. But typically, once the delivery phase, a woman has to physically push the fetus out through the cervix, through the vagina, okay, through until the fetus is born. Eventually, after the fetus comes out and the fetus has been born, the placenta, as you can see here, breaks away from the inside of the uterus, and the placenta comes out through the cervix, through the vagina as well. Typically, the nurse will clamp the umbilical cord, someone will cut the umbilical cord, and then the placenta is delivered after the fetus. Sometimes there are problems in childbirth and labor and delivery, and a doctor may make a decision that they need to remove the fetus more quickly, and they might do what's called a C-section. A C-section is what's done if a vaginal birth is not possible or as dangerous to the mother or the fetus. Basically, the doctor, it's a surgical procedure. The woman will be brought into an operating room, will be given a block, a spinal block, so she doesn't feel the surgery, but she's still awake and aware during it. And they'll make an incision through her abdomen, through the abdominal muscles, through the uterus, and then take the baby out through that incision. And this is a way that the doctor can take the baby out more quickly than waiting for the full process of labor and delivery to take place. This is done if there's, dropping heart rate or problems with the oxygen levels of the fetus. If the baby's in a position when it's feeder first, sometimes a C-section might be done. Also, oftentimes after a woman has one child via C-section, often she will have her next children through C-section as well, but that doesn't always happen. It's a couple videos I will post for you to be able to see sort of an animation of both the vaginal birth and the C-section. To finish up, twins, we all know twins, can be formed in a couple different ways. So fraternal twins are formed when a woman is ovulating, and instead of just releasing one egg, she might ovulate and release two eggs. And if both of those eggs get fertilized, they can both start to develop into an embryo, and then there will be two embryos, two fetuses. And so because those two embryos came from two different egg cells and two different sperm cells fertilized them, they are going to be fraternal. They could be male, female, or they could both be the same sex. They may look quite different from each other because they are no more similar to each other than any other brother, sister, or brother siblings. They just happen to be born at the same time. Sometimes a woman might, especially maybe if she's taking fertility medications, her ovaries may produce 3 or 4 or 5 eggs at once. And that's sometimes when we have, quadruplets or quintuplets born because several of those eggs were fertilized. Identical twins form in a different way. In identical twins, an egg is released, it gets fertilized by an egg cell and forms a zygote. But somewhere in the early stages, while that zygote is dividing by mitosis, it splits apart. And each of those pieces that split apart continue developing, continue through mitosis in all the stages. And they then are going to develop into two different embryos and fetuses, but they both came from the same sperm cell and the same egg cell. They're going to have the exact same genetics as each other because they came from the same sperm and egg cell. So these are identical twins. They're always the same sex. They will look identical to each other because they have all the same chromosomes as the other identical twin. Every once in a while, this happens very late in the embryonic development. And if the two pieces of the embryo don't fully split and stay attached to each other, they may even form conjoined twins in which they share body parts and they may share internal organs and so forth. This is when identical twins, much later in the development, sometimes up to 2 weeks after fertilization, and they don't fully separate. There are many ways that people can try to avoid pregnancy, and we call that contraception or birth control. And these methods of preventing pregnancy vary from abstaining from sex. Obviously, a woman cannot become pregnant if she doesn't have sex, if there's no sperm present to fertilize an egg. And there's a whole variety of ways of avoiding pregnancy, and we can see some of them here. There are hormonal birth control pills that a woman can take, which typically are either made of estrogen or progesterone, which stop her from ovulating. And if a woman doesn't ovulate, then she can't become pregnant. okay, because there's no egg in the fallopian tube to be fertilized by a sperm cell. Condoms can be used by males to prevent sperm cells from reaching the egg cell. Chemicals called spermicides are sometimes used. There's a device called an intrauterine device, IUD, which can be placed into a woman's cervix at a doctor's office, and that prevents her from becoming pregnant. It prevents sperm from reaching the egg, prevents the implantation of any embryo as well. And as we've already talked about, there are surgical means, permanent means of birth control. In men, they can have a vasectomy in which the vas deferens is cut, so the man does not release sperm in the semen any longer, can't make a woman pregnant. Or a tubal ligation in a woman prevents eggs from being fertilized as well. So there's a variety of methods, and they vary in their effectiveness. And we can see that in this graph, that the most effective methods of birth control are the sterilization techniques of a vasectomy or tubal ligation. And you can see these numbers here represent the failure rate. So there's less than 0.5% failure rate of a vasectomy. IUDs are very effective as well. Slightly less effective are things like the pill, oral contraceptives, injectable contraceptives. And then less effective than that are things like condoms, or some couples try to time when that they don't have sex during time when a woman's ovulating, so she's less likely to get pregnant. But again, these are ways that have quite a high failure rate. Trying to time sex so that it doesn't coincide with ovulation fails about 24% of the time, so a significant amount. And so some of these methods also do not prevent the spread of disease. There are several sexually transmitted diseases that things like using a condom can prevent the transmission of those diseases as well. So that's something else that's important to be aware of.